Welcome to the latest addition to the Compliance Podcast Network, the podcast 10 for 10, which brings you the week's top 10 compliance stories curated together in one podcast each week. Tom Fox, the voice of compliance, brings you the compliance professional stories you need to be aware of at the end of your busy week. Sit back and in 10 minutes, hear about the stories every compliance professional should be aware of. Every Saturday, 10 for 10 highlights the most important news, insights, and analysis for the compliance professional, all curated by the voice of compliance, Tom Fox. Get your weekly filling of compliance stories with 10 for 10. Hosted by Tom Fox. 10 for 10 is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network. Also, if you are looking for something new and different for the upcoming Compliance Week celebration in November, check out The Compliance Kids. It's my 3-book children's series on compliance and compliance professionals for children. But they make great gifts and great training tools for your employees. You can check it out on Amazon.com. We've linked to it in the show notes. First, a word from the sponsor of the Compliance Podcast Network for this month, Ethico. Ten for 10 for the week ending September 14th, 2024. Our first story comes to us from Reuters that prosecutors have indicted Albania's ex-prime minister on corruption charges. Sali Berisha has been indicted on corruption charges for actions he took while he was prime minister. He's accused of using his influence to exert pressure to conclude a privatization procedure in favor of a number of persons, including his son-in-law. The former prime minister claims this is a political vendetta, and he denies anything askance. Next, from The Guardian, the story of a movie about Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and the investigation into his corruption, which has bedeviled him over the last several years. The movie was Netanyahu tried to prevent from being shown at the Toronto Film Festival, and they were unsuccessful. It paints a picture of regular gifts expected by Netanyahu, known as Bibi, and his wife Sarah, in exchange for favors. Netanyahu also is seen vehemently denying allegations of his alleged corruption. Interestingly, one of the producers of the movie is Alex Gibney, and he was the director of the movie Enron, the Smartest Guys in the Room. He told an audience following the screening, quote, "I've never seen the depth of moral corruption as I have seen in this man," end quote. Next up, from the New York Times, Police Commissioner Edward Caban has resigned from the New York City Police Department in his role after federal agents seized his phone last week as part of a criminal investigation. The announcement of his departure came this week, and it was effective on Friday the 13th, certainly an appropriate day. New York City Hall has been buffeted by 4 federal investigations, which have resulted in searches and seizures of high-ranking officials within the city. But an inquiry into the city's top law enforcement official is rare, and he's now resigned. Next up, from Bloomberg, it reports that South Africa is addressing its outstanding shortcomings in tackling illicit financial flows, and if it continues to do so, it could exit the global dirty money list of the Financial Action Task Force, or FATF, at some point in 2025. So it is certainly would be positive for South Africa to get off this list. This list has certainly hurt it in terms of trade with other countries. The European Union is slapped Google and Apple with billions in penalties over tax issues, and the court the European Court of Justice sided with the EU order against Apple, for instance, to pay $13 billion for trying to skirt tax duties by allegedly claiming they were an Irish domiciled company. So could be billions from Apple and Google. Our next story comes to us from Politico, which reports that Slovakia has lost the fight against corruption because the prime minister has destroyed the country's corruption-fighting institutions. He has systematically torn them down, no doubt for his own personal gain, but he has outraged the country and created a war on culture against his own country. Next up from the Wall Street Journal, Risk and Compliance Journal, Dylan Tokar reports that John Deere was fined some $9.9 million by the SEC for the company's Thai subsidiary, which courted government officials to win business through extravagant trips to foreign countries and visits to massage parlors. Here's a handy practice tip. If you receive expense reimbursements from massage parlors, you need to go down and tell your BD people to stop it right away, and particularly when they're government officials. So John Deere runs into FCPA hot water. Next up from the Financial Times, ex-Glencore executives from the trading division appear in court, and Glencore's former head of trading, Alex Beard, has pled not guilty, as well as 5 other former executives. They are all charged with paying bribes to get contracts and make money while they were doing energy trading at Glencore. So really no surprise there, but the charges came after a years-long investigation by the SFO into bribery at Glencore, which sourced and traded crude across Africa. Glencore itself had settled with the SFO and the Department of Justice a couple of years ago. So more on Glencore. It's going to be interesting to see how this plays out and whether the UK can successfully prosecute individuals going forward. Next up, our second story from the Financial Times, which reports that largest U.S. accounting firms will have to appoint independent outsiders to help oversee quality under new rules approved by the Securities and Exchange Commission over objections of the industry. EY and PwC made last-minute attempts to stop the new government's rules, but under these new PCAOB standards, firms that audit more than 100 public companies will have to set up an oversight board that includes at least one independent outsider. Around a dozen firms, including the Big Four, will be affected, and it's going to be an additional burden for the Big Four, but given their absolutely disastrous record recently, it's really no surprise. And our final story also comes to us from the Wall Street Journal, Risk and Compliance Journal, this time Richard Vandeford reporting. And it is the new risks that are involved with doing business in Hong Kong, with the Chinese Communist Party taking over the company, or rather the Hong Kong, as much as they have. What are your risks, both from a security risk, physical security, and digital security, but also your inability to even get audited statements out or research third parties? So Hong Kong may become high risk. 10 for 10 is a special production of the award-winning Compliance Podcast Network. As I mentioned at the start of this podcast, our network sponsor is Ethico, and they've got a great new service offering for you, a middle manager's toolkit. We've linked to it in the show notes, and it's available to you at no cost. Many companies struggle with getting information to middle managers, which allows them to be the first line of response in a speak-up culture. And Ethisphere has answered this challenge by putting together a middle manager's toolkit. Check it out in the show notes. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of 10 for 10. I hope you'll check out the newest podcast in the Compliance Podcast Network, the Compliance Tip of the Day. In Compliance Tip of the Day, I give a 5 to 8 minute summary of one tip that you can integrate into your compliance program or put together for greater compliance program efficiency.